All right, Crim 20, welcome to Intro to Corrections. This is a PowerPoint lecture, and I'm going to cover Chapter 1 in this. I will be honest, a lot of the questions on the quizzes, final exam, all that kind of stuff are typically, they come from the book, but I discuss most of them and explain most of them during these lectures. So personally, if I were in this class, I would definitely take the time to listen to the lectures. I know it's kind of boring, but it could be, we would otherwise be sitting in class, which is definitely my preference. But anyways, that's not where we are right now. So, Intro to Corrections, the history of crime and corrections. So we're going to kind of talk about the history of corrections so we can understand where we've been in order to understand where we need to go. But first and foremost, if you are taking a corrections class, it's probably a really good idea for you to understand the definition of corrections. What the heck is corrections? You can just break down the word corrections in and of itself and kind of get your answer to that question. If you're making corrections to something, what are you doing? You're fixing something. You're trying to fix a problem, correct something, make something better. So ultimately, that's what we're talking about. In the world of corrections, we're talking about making offenders better, correcting whatever the issue is that caused them to participate in illegal behavior. Some people are drug addicts, and that's why they commit crimes. So we want to fix that. We want to make sure that they are no longer drug addicts so they don't commit crimes. Some people just don't have jobs. That's why they commit crimes. Some people are mentally ill. That's why they commit crimes. So you can imagine corrections is a pretty big job because there are so many different reasons why people commit criminal behavior or act criminally. So let's move on to defining corrections. The range of community and institutional sanctions, treatment programs, and services for managing criminal offenders. So when we're talking about corrections, a lot of us will automatically think about about people who are locked up in a correctional facility, jail, prison, something like that. But for corrections now, today in our world, looks a lot different than it may have or than it did 100 years ago. Community corrections, and that's where we're kind of mention that the whole word community here are definitely more common, much more common now than they used to be, and much more common than institutional sanctions. So community corrections, people under the supervision of probation, parole, some sort of a correctional officer in the community, versus institutional corrections. Institutional corrections, we're talking about people who are actually in custody, prison, jail, juvenile hall, those types of facilities. Okay? So the goal is to treat them and manage the criminal offenders. Penology is a word that we used to use to describe the study of punishment for criminal acts. So this also kind of gives you an idea of the current vibe, I don't know, for lack of a better term. What is the goal when dealing with offenders? It used to be punishment. It is now treatment. Makes sense? We used to just lock people up and throw away the key. Now we try and fix them. All right. So, next slide. Mission of corrections: to protect society, accomplished through a combination of surveillance, control of offenders, rehabilitative services, incapacitation. So, ultimately, the number one goal should always be the protection of society. And ultimately, if you go on to the Fresno County Probation Department or the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation website, their mission is probably going to start with to protect society. So that's their number one goal, to protect society from a person who is obviously victimizing people in the community. And how do they do that? Well, they control people by either supervising them through surveillance or locking them up. When we say incapacitation, that means the person is locked up. Okay, so this is kind of a typical mission for most correctional agencies. So there are three major components in the criminal justice system. You've probably taken other classes in criminology before, so you're pretty aware that law enforcement, courts, and corrections are the three major components in the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system in California versus the criminal justice system in Iowa are probably different. So not all jurisdictions work the same way. In California specifically, we have an interesting way of doing a lot of things. So anyways, keep that in mind. Not all jurisdictions do things the exact same way. Most of the stuff that we're going to focus on in this class, I'm going to be referring to the way we do it in California, because we are in California. So this is just a random statistics sheet from 2009. Of the 10.6 million felony crimes known to police in 2009, 1.8 million offenders were arrested, only 17%. 1.2 million were convicted, only 11%. And 496,926 were given a sentence of imprisonment, which is only 4.7%. 1980, the correctional population, so that's how many people in the United States were in custody, 1.8 million. In 2012, 6.9 million. Big numbers, okay? So who works in a correctional facility? You have, of course, your correctional officers, but they're not the only people that work in those facilities. You have administrators, maintenance workers, medical staff, food staff, financial managers. Corrections is a booming business. People are making money off of corrections. Just cities in general, like Corcoran, for example, Coalinga. Those are two places where there are state facilities. Corcoran was just probably a one-road town before the prison actually was built there. Financially now, the city is doing very well, and they're doing very well because of the correctional facility being in their community. So, really quick, again, this is probably stuff that you have already learned in another class, but I'm going to go over them really quickly. These are different theories of why people commit crimes and how punishment and or rehabilitation can help keep people from doing this again in the future. So the classical school, I use this perfect example. Oh, for me, it's a perfect example. I have a neighbor who has a dog that I really hate. The dog barks all the time, day and night, and day and night, and day and night. I think to myself, can you get rid of that dog? Is there something you could do to maybe make that dog disappear? I think about it and I think about it, and I say, well, what would the benefits be? The benefit would be I would never have to hear that dog bark again. Let's say I did something bad to the dog and I got caught. What would the consequences be? They'd be pretty bad. I would embarrass my family. I would get arrested. I might lose my job. I could end up in jail. My neighbors would all hate me. So I'm going to weigh the pros and cons of that criminal behavior. Do I want to kill the dog or do I not want to kill the dog? If I kill the dog, I never have to listen to him bark again. If I don't, but if I get caught for killing the dog, would that be worse than having to listen to the dog bark day and night? Weighing the pros and cons. I have free will and rational choice. I choose not to kill the dog because I know the consequences of that behavior would outweigh the pleasure I receive from not having to hear that dog bark. Pleasure-pain principle. That's also part of this hedonistic calculus. So the classical school of criminology ultimately believes that people have free will and we choose whether or not to commit criminal acts. The responsibility is on us. We, the individual, make the choice. Okay. The positivist school of criminology, Cesar Lombroso, basically came up with the positive school of criminology. His belief was that Basically, being a criminal was in your DNA. When you were born, you were automatically born a criminal. You did not have free will. You were predetermined to be a criminal. He went so far as to say that certain people with different physical traits, like maybe big foreheads, long arms, were more likely to be criminals because they weren't as evolved as other people. Okay, now I'm not saying I believe in any of this stuff, but what I'm saying is there are a lot of different theories of crime and punishment. And those are two of the big ones. The neoclassical school kind of pulls those two together. But ultimately, we're talking about free will, meaning I choose to commit the behavior, versus determinism. That is the concept that I am a born criminal and I really have no choice in the matter. Okay, again, overview. All this is in your book. So early responses to crime. So when we consider the early responses to crime, meaning the way criminal behavior was handled early on in the United States and in other countries, incarceration was not common. It was not a common form of actual punishment like we use it now. It was actually used basically to hold people in custody until their punishment could be imposed or their fines were paid off. So we think of now being locked up as part of our punishment, consequences for behavior, whatever. That's not always the way it was. Typically, there were things like fines, money, fines, payoffs. If someone was considered bad enough and not to be trusted in a community, they would be banished or basically sent off to live in another country or on an island or on a ship or wherever. So that was another form of punishment. And the third and probably the most common, my guess, is corporal punishment, meaning they were actually physically beaten, killed, hanged, whipped, stoned, pretty much you name it. So these are the old responses to criminal behavior. So in 1777, this guy, John Howard, was living in England, and he became interested in how the jails were being run during that time. So he toured a bunch of different jails in England and was horrified by what he saw. He saw filthy conditions where people were horrifically treated, and he pushed at that point for reform. So to change up the way criminals were being treated at that time. Then in the United States, the Quakers, a religious group, came, and they had different beliefs about punishment as well. They were the ones that basically came up with the whole concept that if you didn't kill someone, you shouldn't be put to death. So they believed that capital punishment, and that is the death penalty, was only appropriate for a murder charge. And that remains today in the United States. If you did not kill somebody, if no one died, no one is going to be put to death. So in order to be eligible for the death penalty, no matter how horrific the crime was, if someone did not die, they will not be put to death. So we also then became a nation that used jails or penitentiaries. So when we talk about a penitentiary, I am Catholic, Irish Catholic, whatever. And this is the way and I'm using this as an example, not because I'm trying to push any kind of religious agenda. So please don't think that. But just as an example, if you are Catholic, you've probably gone to confession, where you go and you tell the priest all the bad stuff that you did, and then you ask him to forgive you, and he will give you your, what we call penance. Penance is basically is your way of reflecting and quietly praying for the knowledge to make better behavior in the future. So let's say I went into the priest told me to do 10 Our Fathers and 5 Hail Marys, whatever. That would be my penance. So the whole concept of a penitentiary, which was an old school jail / prison, was that people were to go into these facilities and quietly think about what they did wrong and how they can improve their behaviors. So penitentiaries were typically silent, like you were not allowed to speak in a penitentiary. So the Pennsylvania system was set up in the United States. It was a penitentiary where inmates were held in solitary confinement. They were locked in a cell and they were not allowed to speak to anyone for months. Months and months and months. Okay. Then it changed a little bit. Sorry, let me go back to Pennsylvania. They couldn't even interact with others. All they did was sit in their cell and think about how bad they were. They were performing their penance. Auburn's system was a little bit different in that they were able to work together, but they still couldn't talk. You can imagine what the consequences of this were. There are times when I think I could be locked up in a room with no human contact for months on end. But realistically, they went crazy. But this is the first kind of the development of prisons through in the United States. So in the 1800s, you can think of a reform school where there was very strict discipline. That is kind of the concept of the prison system between 1870 and 1910. Then we have the industrial era. So imagine during this time we have World War I and World War II going on, and a lot of our young men were out at war. So we needed people to work. Guess who were the perfect people to work at that time? You guessed it, prisoners. So that's why we would call that the industrial era. Prisoners were being forced to do work, ultimately. Basically because the young men throughout the country were off at war if they were not in prison. Period of transition. This is an interesting time, and I'm probably going to ask you something about this hands-off doctrine. There was a time when the courts basically said, prisons, do your thing. We are not going to intervene in anything that you do. Which maybe at the time initially sounded like a great idea. But think about this. Who did an inmate turn to if they were being abused, starved, beaten, if there were abuses in the prison system? They didn't have anywhere to go. So ultimately, the prison did whatever they wanted to do between 1935 and 1960. Then 1960, the courts became involved again. So think about the 1960s. We're talking Vietnam, peace, love, all that kind of stuff. This was the beginning of the rehabilitative era. And this is a time when people went to prison and were seen as kind of sick. You know, we need to make you well, so we're going to rehabilitate you and fix you. And that's basically what the medical model was. They would compare it to something like a person who had cancer. If you have cancer, you're going to go to a hospital, a doctor, you're going to get treatment, and you're going to get better. That's kind of the concept of the rehabilitative era in regards to crime. Your criminal behavior, it was an illness and it needed to be fixed. Okay? So, reintegration, once a person was fixed, they were reintegrated back into the community. You can already imagine how this goes, right? And you're going to see the next the phrase in quotes there, nothing works. That didn't work. None of this stuff has worked. Nothing works. And unfortunately, this is a really sad part of the world of corrections. We haven't had a whole heck of a lot of success throughout history in properly rehabilitating or punishing offenders. In the early 1980s, 90s, early 2000s, probably about the time when I was in high school, over at Fresno City College, Fresno State, the crime rates started to really, really climb. I call this the crack era. I mean, I don't just call it the crack era, but I refer to it as the crack era because crack cocaine seemed to have just a ridiculously significant impact on criminal behavior. People were committing crimes like crazy left and right during that time. Violent crime was just off the hook. So we started locking people up again. Let's see what we have here. Okay. It was about this time, and it actually started in Fresno when the 3 strikes law came into effect. People were tired of people going to prison back here in the 60s and 80s and getting out because they were all fixed. and then going back out and murdering other people. So you'll think you have 3 strikes, basically two serious violent felonies followed by 1 felony, and you were locked up forever. Did that work? No, it didn't work either. Okay. So what are some concepts for punishment? Retribution. I would consider that something like an eye for an eye, vengeance, revenge. Okay, that's kind of one of the theories behind punishment. I'm going to skip deterrence as I'm going to go back to that one. Incapacitation is when a person is locked up, so they actually literally physically can't commit a crime because they're locked up. Rehabilitation, you know what that is. You're working with an offender to try and fix the problem. Restitution. Restitution and retribution are very different, because restitution is just basically making the victim whole again. So if you smashed up their front window of their house, you paid for it. If you stole their car, you paid for it. So that's kind of what restitution is, as opposed to retribution, eye for an eye, vengeance, revenge. Okay, so deterrence. We have specific deterrence and general deterrence. I'm going too long, but I'm going to keep going because this is one of my favorite stories. It's not true, but I like to use this. So I'm going to talk about the difference between specific and general deterrence. Specific deterrence, we're going to go with that one first. This is a story, okay? I went out to a party with my husband. We drove to our friend's house. We went to a party, and I had 8 shots of Fireball whiskey in 1 hour. I walked back out to the car with the keys in my hand, and I'm getting ready to drive home. And I remember that DUI that I got 5 years ago. Do you remember that? Okay, I'm making this up too, so don't get all, Okay, remember that DUI you got? Remember how horrible I felt? Remember how much money it cost me? Remember how embarrassing it was? Remember when I had to go to the jail? And remember I didn't have a driver's license for a year because it got suspended because I got that DUI? I don't want that to happen to me again, so I'm not going to drink and drive. I'm being deterred from drinking and driving because of a specific example of something that happened to me. Okay. This, again, it's a story. I didn't really get a DUI. Okay, general deterrence. We're going to use the same kind of story. At least we're going to start out the same way. My husband and I decided to drive to a friend's house, and I have 8 shots of Fireball in the first hour, and then it's time to go. And we walk out to the car, and I look at my husband, and I say, oh my gosh, I do not want to have a DUI like you did. That is also a story. I don't want to have to go through what you went through. I'm going to learn from your lesson from watching you, and I'm not going to drink and drive. Okay? That makes sense? Okay, so read the book for more clarification. Restorative Justice is a program where the victim and the offender get together with a mediator, and they try and work out a resolution to a case or a criminal act without court involvement. Big push for this right now in the criminal justice world. And then I don't know how recidivism pops up here, but recidivism is a way an agency or a correctional agency or correctional agency or what am I trying to say here? A facility can prove whether they are successful or not. Recidivism is when an offender who has completed a correctional treatment program, whether they've been detained, they did drug court, they went to counseling, whatever, and then re-offended. Okay, so recidivist is a person who has gone through a correctional program, completed it, and then re-offended. Okay? Maybe not even completed it. So that's what recidivism is. I think this is the end. Sorry, that was too long.